Are you all comfortable and not feeling like there are hierarchical seating arrangements? Because we want to extend our hospitality. It's not clear who invited whom or how this works. That will constitute itself as we work together and talk together. So today we thought, Anne Dufont-Montel and I, that we would combine our classes in order to continue the work that we're doing together, us, and it's not clear how to demarcate the together here, but let's bear that in mind, because today part of the thematic drive involves something that is at least implicitly part of the EGS experience, understanding that experience contains peri, which is danger, and risk, which is the risk of engaging the other and being engaged by and called to and called upon by the other. One of our more philosophical questions, are you okay back there, David? And yeah, good. One of the questions that we want to raise, and note that we don't take anything for granted, because what is a question? Can one imagine philosophy without a question? Werner Hamacher, with whom some of you have worked, wrote an essay, a philosophical essay, questioning the question and without question marks. Very difficult. In fact, if we were practicing with writing, we would assign you a paper without question marks, which for some of you is fine and normal fare, but not if it's a philosophically inflected paper. So one of the questions, and we're questioning questions that we're raising here, is how to question the other and what the limits of questioning are. When Heidegger addresses the question that imposes itself on him, he writes, "Was heißt denken?" What is called thinking, question mark. So what about this interrogatory manner, disposition, pose? At what point does the interrogation become a police interrogation, or when is it not a police interrogation? And as Dostoevsky, the great masochist, the great Russian masochist of whom Freud has written, has said, and has portrayed, the masochism is not necessarily unpleasant. There's great joy for certain subjects, and perhaps anyone who's involved here right now in philosophical speculation and inquiry might as well surrender to the fact of a driving masochistic politics with regard to being and thought. Not an accusation, I'm just welcoming you to my club. So, what does it mean to be invited to interview? What constitutes interview, interrogation, questioning? This is the topic of Magnolia's thesis, the interview as a philosophical figure of contemplation and inquiry. And who were the first questioners also? What are the pitfalls and the abysses of the interview as a form of philosophical reflection? What are the bypasses, the shortcuts, or the shocking revelations of perhaps an inappropriate, assuming we know what's proper and appropriate, nature to the philosophical, let's say, tact and behaviors? When Socrates, that bully punk, stopped people and performed dialectics in back alleys of the polis and pulled out his switchblade. My Socrates. He goes, all right, what the fuck does this mean? And, the guys from the other side, oh, we could do a dance and be West Side Storied out, when you're a sophist, you're a, no. So, Socrates, he's not holding back. He's really prodding, prompting, intruding, bodily piercing. Philosophy was already tattooing the body of the other, inscribing, pushing, questioning, and questioning was already part of a kind of polemical, let's just call it intrusiveness. I mean, you're questioning, in French, la question is also, if I'm not mistaken, torture. You're torturing something out, you're worrying something. It's not innocent, it's not neutral. Not that you violated me too much, but where I wanted to go, but we'll get back to that. Listen, I'm still carrying the scars, we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk. One of the, let's say, difficult boundaries of the interview, and let me know if you've thought of this, I thought about this morning, involves the limit between knowledge and curiosity. Thank you. As long as we see Jamie here, I'm also going to say about the interview, the questioning, the question or the theme or motif that emerges is what it means to work with and be accompanied by the other, as I was accompanied by and held and strengthened by the work that I tried to present publicly the other evening. So the limit between knowledge and something like curiosity, you know that curiosity is a downgrade in philosophical grammars and behaviors, and it's also feminized and objected. Now, the first curious troublemaker on one of our textual histories that still bind us was Eve. Right? She, for Nietzsche, was the first scientist. This is why God punished her. Eve was curious, which is to say she had to have knowledge. And as Nietzsche says, Nietzsche identifies with Eve. She was sassy, she needed to know, she felt she had the right to know, and she did not listen to the man who was beholden to his God and was very happy, apparently, it was paradise after all, to live in legislated ignorance. So according to Nietzsche, the woman in Nietzsche, we know about Nietzsche's misogynist rants, but that's also because in Nietzsche, every object or thing or motif is split in at least two ways. There's the good, fabulous, inspiriting, exciting woman, and then there's the pain in the ass, what he calls feminist woman, who's full of prohibition and anger and ressentiment. Nietzsche discovered the trope of ressentiment as a way of analyzing and thinking world and history. In any case, the woman in Nietzsche was birthed by Eve because Eve needed to know. Eve just tossed off the restrictions and strictures of the master prohibitor. And she got her ass so punished that we're still reeling from that permanent exile, eviction, and punishment. Nonetheless, for Nietzsche, she's the scientist, the primary, primal, exemplary scientist who will go up against the phallus, the law, And this is what science exemplarily risks. The most recent book of Avital Ronell is about, not only about, but it's an éloge in praise of risk and what risk-taking, which is a Nietzschean proposition, what that involves and means, and how you crash against walls of experience when you take risks. So curiosity has a feminine edge, perhaps, and it's considered to belong to the vulgar, the more vulgar neighborhoods of philosophical intervention. Nonetheless, it's inevitable that curiosity will play its part in an interview. It might be repressed or watered down or revamped and given an overhaul to look respectable. But Nietzsche always brings us back to that troublemaker Eve, and that troublemaking is part of the valence and description of the scientific philosophical mind. But it also means being open to retaliatory responses and volleys from the other side, if there's another side. Another thing I wanted to point out before we hand over the mic is, again, in what is called thinking, was heißt denken, which is about calling already in the title. We could jam on the title for hours. Why does Heidegger call out the question of thinking? In that text, he shows and insists that thinking is intimately linked to thanking. Denken und danken are absolutely inextricable. What does that mean? What does that tell us? I'm thinking even in yoga of the gratitude pose. What does it suggest about the way you bow to the other? The way I want to thank you also for your tremendous generosity. This, in some ways, is Heidegger's way of saying polemics or duking it out, the way, or academic turkey shoots, or that kind of violence is not thinking. But that's something we're going to question today. In other words, if thinking and thanking are absolutely paired for Heidegger, it suggests a disposition, an opening, also something that is, as you will see in Levinas and maybe Blanchot, absolutely asymmetrical. It doesn't mean that they're two equal pairs or partners, but one bows before the other and the other's magnitude and majesty. That is why Levinas says that equality isn't enough, isn't radical enough, because equality is just a mathematical equation. But before the other, when you find yourself before the other, the ethically laudable posture or position is to recognize the greatness of the other without trying to match up prints or sizes. This has a lot of implications. In my own work on stupidity, I've just tried to suggest an ethics in which one would say, instead of always attacking the other as stupid or somehow minoritizing or persecuting the other, just what does it mean to say, I am stupid before the other, which is something that I'll leave in the air. So Anne and I have a book together. Where is it? Which is called Fighting Theory. Oh, here it is, repressed. And that's what we're also going to organize our conversation. And we welcome your participation and intervention, but I hand it over to you.
Thank you, and much gratitude of being here with you at your invitation, because it's your invitation. And I want to go back to this asymmetrical question, because in many ways it's something that can bewilder us today. We are always thinking in terms of equality, and this revendication of an asymmetrical relationship between the I and the other is endlessly putting us into insomnia, or should. And I just want to quote this little Kierkegaard sentence I like, that is, the most one can do for another in those areas where each individual is dealing with himself is to make him anxious. So that to me is the opening land of maybe what you call curiosity, that can go from the most shallow sort of nagging sort of what's this object, to the most intimate and intricate question of, let's say, the soul towards the world. And it's interesting to see that in the first path of philosophy, it's as astonishment, or in the first path of an encounter, like in a psychoanalytical session, or even in an encounter, in an interview, there is like a reversed way that's to be initiated first. And to me it's really the signature of the philosophical stanza, in a way, that is, let's forget that I knew what I knew. Let's put aside, not so much in a Cartesian doubting way, but in a more existential way. That is everything for which I knew I was holding on. That is my belongings as thoughts too, as facts. And let's put it in doubt, but doubt as curiosity. It doesn't mean necessarily to just reject them, but to lift them from the ground and say, maybe all this what made my world is irrelevant. I think it's interesting to see that both in the philosophical, most, I would say, abstract reasoning, or in a psychoanalytical session, it all begins with going back to the point where I know that I don't know anything, or in, let's say, as it would be of my past, of my family, what is the closest to me, the people I like the most, or the way I related to my own history or to the history of my country. Maybe this is all a makeup. Maybe what I think is even my most intimate belonging, for example, a first souvenir, this is already a makeup, something that's forged. So this principle of going back to the unknown, to the principle of the unknown, that's the Socratic démarche, is the breaking free of, and I might go back to this Heidegger essence of human freedom, where he says we can't go directly to what freedom is. We have to go to the negative way first. Well, he sort of says hello to Kant and says, Kant has tried to reach what would be freedom, and especially freedom of thought, as pure spontaneity of the being. But I will go the negative way, that is, let's take freedom from the point of view of breaking free from and setting, again, it's this movement of exiling yourself. And this is, I think, the first predisposition to the otherness as in thought or as in relationship. And for example, when I went to the first time in the seminar of Derrida, but I did the same with you, so I had this sensation that before I had, listened to great masters in philosophy, Habermas included, and I would say that the last year of Foucault au Collège de France, that was also of the same realm, but he would invite you to go along a certain way in a seminar, like, let's look at this landscape. Here are the objects we're going to talk about. We are sure of, and suddenly he would take the rug off, and you would be in front of the void and says, haha, now we're going to begin thinking. And this event to put you in front of the void of what you thought was yours, was your belonging as objects of thought, is to me the real experience of philosophy. And in this interview we did, I had the same sensation that although I could question you over sometimes the faits généalogiques, historical facts of your moving along the history of philosophy and your own choices, it always brought me back to this sort of unknown, vertiginous land of what I had always heard on a certain point, on a certain horizon, was just a little aside. And if you let it, if you think about it from an aside point of view, then it changes the whole vision, of course. And to say with to come with the Eve question, it's interesting to see that this feminine side of what you call the feminine in Nietzsche, or I would say this capacity of being visited by the idea and not thinking that you have an idea, but you are in a certain way the host, the guest of an idea, is interrogating again this, I would say, entre guillemets, feminine side of the thinker and the way we can think the world. And the asymmetry here is so important because it reminds us that the other is, we come from the other. We are not born as a self, we are born from another. So the other is not only inside us as the calling, like in the prophetic calling, but it is also in the memory of our limb, of our skin, of what constitutes us as this unknown plant. So,
right, beautiful, thank you. So I thought that I might explain or just go through some checkpoints with you, unless you already have a menu you want to produce of what we want to discuss. But shall I just start us off, and then please press pause, even mute, and rewind, or do whatever you need to do for us to have the sensation of the vertiginous sensation of being together.
Can I just ask you about why this title? That was
okay, why the title? You see, I was about to sing Vorsingen, as we say in German, and immediately deflated me and asked me to answer a question. What does it mean? Is it a demande, as we say in French? You know what a demande is. It's very important in Lacan, of course. The question that one asks always in Lacan is, what is your demande? When someone calls you, when someone is not with you or with you. The essential, let me just make it easy on me and us. The essential question in the relation to the other is, what is your demand? What do you want from me? What's your request? What's your demand? When someone is up in your face or aggressive or sweet, anything, the question that might be a leading question, and also of a text, I have very intimate relations to some texts. Sometimes I come home and they're like, and where were you, Missy? Like, I wasn't reading them, I wasn't writing them, they feel abandoned. I mean, okay, that's my spectral colloquy. But what is the demand put on you? So I'm not going to limit it to the other as peeps or people or human figures. It also could be a very angry, judgmental dog that's been waiting all day, is going to piss on your sofa, right? Here's my response to your absence. So what is the demand there? And what are the transferential structures of any teaching, of any being with, of any interrogatory encounter? What is the encounter? I mean, these are pedagogical questions as well. How would we read our encounter here? What is the event of the encounter? If an event is to be truly an event, according to Derrida, of whom we are both daughters, and in some ways sons too, if an event is to be understood as an event, you can't even conceive it. A true event isn't something that you can say, this is an event. It escapes you. It whizzes by, or it doesn't leave a mark or a trace for a very long time. Its delay call forwarding system is very intricate and complex. A true event of an encounter may show up in your unconscious, in your dreams. You may, a year from now, have a dream in which the other is calling to you, or you may have missed the event of the event. For an event to be an event, it can also be catastrophic and devastating and have no narrative recouping powers. You may not be able to hold it and contain it and say it. It may be the unsayable, as Levinas says. So we can't think we know what constitutes an event. For an event to be an event, it can be devastating and kind of stun gun you and wipe out your memory. It shares qualities with trauma, so you may get at it through flashback mechanisms or very shallow, superficial signaling systems that you can't even yet designate. Anyway, nonetheless, and with every word we use, we're trained to put it into question too, so that we understand how hesitatingly we must proceed. Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe once wrote that sometimes you must rigorously hesitate. That hesitation can be rigorous. I know there's many philosophical attitudes, and I mean that in every sense, that give you attitude. Einstellung, according to Husserl. There are many philosophical attitudes and dispositions that erase the phase of hesitation and that make proud and totalizing proclamations and decisive assertions and affirmations or disaffirmations. That's something to be aware of in the contiguous neighborhood of other types of probes and hesitations that take risks, that mess up phenomenally, that have to start over again in a Sisyphusian way. or as Larry says, Sisyphusian way. You just get slapped back or smacked down, and you have to start all over again. And so there are the probes that are hesitating, and even there's the question of exhaustion and fatigue that I'm sure you don't know about here. But one of the last conversations with Lyotard that I had, because he was tired, I was tired, we were drooping from fatigue, was how to think exhaustion. For Levinas, metaphysics has been exhausted. You know that the earth, our beautiful mother and baby, has been depleted and exhausted. And all the themes and motifs of exhaustion, the exhaustion of metaphysics, the exhaustion of the promise of philosophy, which no longer brings with it or delivers the vitality with which it was mandated, which no longer holds its promises or shows you how to live or to love or to affirm life. Philosophy is also exhausted in many ways, but there are fresh departures here and there, spontaneous growths that you wouldn't expect between the crevices of a desert-like landscape. Things do occur. Now, I don't even remember where I was going. Does anyone want to give me my GPS? Okay, and what? Demande, thank you. The transferential, as I'm dragging myself through the desert. So what are the conditions of transference? Does everyone know what transference is? Yeah? Okay. I don't take anything for granted, and I'm very happy to give subtitles, you know, where I can press a button and offer explanations. And don't be shy. Don't forget, I'm the world expert on stupidity, so the more idiotic, the happier I am. So, then there's countertransference. Do you know what that is and where that came from? Do you want to know what that is? That is, and this is what's so amazing about working with Anne, and it's also a trap, I have to say. You know, what does it mean, or does every questioner become what Anne also is, which is a psychoanalyst? You know, to sit with a philosopher and duke it out, this is one thing. But when you have the calm generosity and what Heidegger calls the serenification of being in one person who's sitting there and asking you stuff and saying things and seeing things, and just knowing that she occupies that position, not only of the sujet supposé savoir, as Lacan said, the subject supposed to know, so she comes as a philosopher, but knowing that this is also a psychoanalyst, your native gag orders kind of are released, and you start babbling. Suddenly I'm talking about my psycho brother. Okay, you don't have to know about this. And I realized, Thomas, that's why you're either Thomas or Thomas, because my brother shares your name, so I have to protect you from those precincts, because I have, okay, never mind. So, countertransference in Freud was invented or discovered, to his considerable chagrin and horror, in the case study called the Ratman. No, that's the nickname. It's called the case study of obsessional neurosis. When Freud discovered that he had an analysand or patient who was so smart and savvy and brilliant, and his neuroses were so delicious and disclosive and revelatory, and something horrible happened to Freud. He loved his patient, and guess what? The patient got cured too quickly, says Freud. What does it mean to get cured too quickly? Freud could have been happy and put a flag on his map of conquests. The way I do, you should. All right, never mind. Freud could have been joyous. This guy was relieved of his neurotic inhibitions and prohibitions and command systems. The obsessional neurotic converts any constitutive statement into an injunction or a law. One of the examples is that the Ratman will go to the train station. He just wanted to look at the schedule, and a conductor walks by and says, "Are you taking the 11 o'clock to Vienna?" He goes, "Holy shit, I had no intention of going to Vienna today." So because even a question is converted into a command for the obsessional neurotic. Do you have that too? I hope so. It's a wonderful way of living. When someone says, "Do you want to do this or that?" and there's no fucking way you're going to do it, you go, "Okay, when do you need it done by?" You know? So the obsessional neurotic has a relation to utterance that turns any utterance, no matter how constitutive, and then, of course, Ratman was on the train to Vienna. He had another appointment. This was a big mess for him, you know? But anything that anyone says to you goes through a kind of circuitry and catalytic converter and becomes and is a command, which has implications for the relation of Freud, because Freud coached him also. He said, "Today we will talk about," what would he talk about? No, he had a very distinguished, that's Heidegger. He had a very distinguished British kind of English. Beautiful. In any case, here he discovers countertransference, which means that he had a transference and fell in love with his patient. This is something that happens sometimes in the pedagogical scene, where someone becomes the addressee, perhaps, where things are directed and oriented toward that other suddenly that looms and emerges and may persecute, because for Freud it was very persecutory to realize that you're vulnerable to this other, whereas you're supposed to be the shrink and the master of the discursive conversation. So thinking of what an interview is it close to conversation? What is conversation? You have a lot in Blanchot, who wrote The Infinite Conversation, L'Entretien Infini, Levinas, who explains what happens in conversation. A betweenness arises. It's not that one is talking to the other, but something happens in between, in the interval between one and the other, so that it's not entirely an and it's not entirely I who brought forth or spoke, but something happened between us that has its own life form, in a sense. Okay, so let me say a couple of things about this title, which is what you ask about, and I won't go into what is a title, what entitles a title, and so on and so forth. But there is the pressure, as you all know, from all sorts of unsavory zones of consideration, such as marketing and so on. I had other titles, but the press accepted this one, which wasn't necessarily the first contender, Fighting Theory. So now it's become the name, and so there's no, you don't want to make a text or a person or a dog or anyone schizophrenic by changing names and wishing it had another name. That's its name right now, Fighting Theory. And I think what people might like about it, who make decisions about how your title is going to fly or not, is that first of all, it suggests already an internal strife, which is to say, am I fighting with theory, or is this fighting theory? Is this the theory of fight? Is this how, and the introduction, as some of you saw, is called The Scene of Fighting, which resonates with Derrida's important text called The Scene of Writing. Freud and the scene of writing. So a scene of fighting. Let me back up before I try to start engaging us in this. I was thinking this morning, again, about Lacoue-Labarthe and what he said about the 20th century. There are three major motifs or appropriations of thought in the 20th century. Three fundamental motifs that have come around to us. One is that of struggle, and that would be the Marxist or Marxian. Our relation to world and to thought is struggle, as in the class struggle, as in activism. There's a kind of effort of struggle with what is. The other, yet another fundamental motif that came up in the 20th century would be that of mission. You're on a mission, thinking is part of a mission, thinking is a mission or a missile that has to transform and bring about world in a certain way, and that he associates with Heidegger and that district of thought and its relation to thought. You're on a mission, your thinking mandates you in a certain way and gives you an assignment, such as giving you a mission. I would, of course, if Philippe were here, and he is here because we're talking with him and of him, I would want to see how these are not strictly separable and disjointed, but nonetheless it's very helpful. The third major motif, would anyone be able to muster it or imagine it? It's not obvious, but once it's stated, you'll remember, is the task, such as Benjamin offers it, which is, for example, the task, die Aufgabe of the translator. And you are, even Nietzsche sometimes says, it befell me, it was a task, it's my duty. It goes even against my nature, Nietzsche says, but it was my task. The word Aufgabe in German is very rich and necessary for us because it also contains not only the thought of the gift, the Gabe, but as in English and other languages, it involves giving up, giving, gift, gift up, giving up, give it up, surrender, you've lost, you can't do it. It's an encounter with its own impossibility. Your relation to the task involves already an encounter with something that exceeds the limits of intelligibility or possibility. So the task, the Aufgabe, is something that in committing yourself to it and taking it on and welcoming it and hosting it, as you say, you already know that it's hostage and you're defeated by the very task that calls you. So for Lacoue-Labarthe, there's the struggle, the mission, and the task in great macro-structural waves in 20th century thinking. I was nurtured by that. So there's a sense of struggle in fighting, but fighting is also a street term. And one of the things that I've tried to do is stay close to the street, not only for street cred, but for all sorts of, as we just said about Socrates. I'm interested in the way philosophy was also part of an agonistic politics, or even street theater. Philosophy and theater in the beginning were pretty closely allied. You couldn't tell the difference. It was a performance. It is a performance. It is something that stages itself. the questions that I try to imagine coming out of fighting theory also involve who fights, what fights, where does it resist, as we said in our seminar the other day. Try to, even the word resistance, of course, has everything to do with a struggle. And fighting, as Freud and others pointed out to us, is part of an internal conflict. Now, what are the words for struggle or fighting? What does that encompass? What could be an imagined lexicon? It involves, in Heidegger, strife, so the fourfold and attentional qualities of the struggle between earth and sky, pulling each other apart and at each other. So there's a combative, this is not politically correct. I mean, Jacques likes to work with me, says he, because we're not politically correct. Whatever, well, you know what that means with him. So the thing is, what would it be to be itching for a good fight, to enjoy a brawl? All of these things are not necessarily sanctioned, and certainly not as a philosophical stance, and certainly not for something that presents itself provisionally in the feminine, right? So here I'm going to go in there with all sorts of even futural, equipmental, kind of fantastical musculation and super heroic mythemes. That's already, you see the irony in all that, maybe not, but the question of fighting it out, duking it out, there's all sorts of levels of conflict. Now we can think of Kant, who wrote about Streit, as in the Streit der Fakultäten, which is translated as the conflict of the faculties. The conflict of the faculties. And of course I've written a lot, as you have and so on war. So I'm still trying to see where war takes place. And I will just say one more thing before we open it up and continue to talk. Where does war take place? For Hegel, everyone was schlepped into the war zone, and it schlepped into your bodies. Every citizen was imprinted by war. Nowadays, where is the field of battle? It's kind of ejected. You have drones and so on. You know all of this. But my question was always, what are the zoning ordinances appropriate to war? Where does war start or begin? Where does it not stop? For Hegel, war was a kind of pregnancy test of historical becoming. Every war supplied meaning. The French Revolution, every war had a meaning and gave a meaning. Think of the great tragedies, or even the great tragedy Hamlet. Who arrives at the end of Hamlet? Do you remember? When Hamlet brings the whole house down in suicidal furor. Fortinbras, so strong arm, a figure of war, of severance, of newness, a place of promise, futurity, and a fresh stash of meaning. So every war for Hegel had a meaning, offered meaning, and it held everyone hostage. Nowadays, the battlefields are so remote or virtual and so on and so forth that they're not considered to be internalizable necessarily. Now, the war zone, of course, extends to and emerges from the body. You're at war with yourself. It's not as though war happens outside in some elsewhere that's policed or for which there's a no man's land that can protect you or cushion you in some way. War, as Freud and Kafka and others have noted, begins inside. Or Goethe in Faust calls it Streben, or a kind of striving, a struggle and a striving, because zwei Seelen wohnen in meinem Brust. Two souls inhabit my breast, or my heart, or my mind. So I'm inhabited and riven and torn apart by two souls. I'm the divided self. I'm divided against myself. I turn against myself. I have a superego that has gathered together a groundswell of troops and a SWAT team that watches me every moment where I try to stray or aberrate from what superego thinks I should be doing. Cruel superego makes you be disciplined and spend August studying. I mean, whose idea was this? We could be floating around in pools, drinking endlessly, you know. We could be high in different ways, not in the Alps, and so on and so on. Superego decides that's not the way that's just not gonna happen. You just don't know enough, you don't have enough, you haven't collected enough diplomas, you haven't known enough, you haven't learned enough, you're gonna go where I tell you. So that's already a struggle, because the id side has other plans and other itineraries, and another travel agency altogether that was shut down because superego hands you the tickets and says, this is what you're doing. So it's not as though fighting is outside or in some imagined outside. It happens maybe in every encounter. And then there was just a rhetorical supplement that I would like to bring. Also, the fact that for the Greeks, wrestling and fighting and philosophizing was part of Olympic behavior. The Olympics, now I am waiting. I have applied for the Olympics. And they're, okay, we'll call you. I want to bring it back. I want to stand up there and do the philosophical originary Olympiad, athletic, poetic, philosophical, triple axel thing that I can do, and so on and so forth. Dialectize. The Olympics involve people who could do dialectics better than each other. You know, it's competition. That's a question. Benjamin asks us to think about the difference between the contest and thinking, or the contest and the test, another issue that we can talk about. So what's competition? I know there's none here, but we can nonetheless think about it. Also, internal competition. You're always pushing yourself. You're not the yogi I want you to be. You're never satisfied, which has its advantages and importance too. But let's give space for the reflection on competition, contest, and so on and so forth, and the implications for winning. Does someone win a fight? I try to say that I'm in that kind of rope-a-dope, humiliated position that doesn't allow for winning, even though Muhammad Ali had the triumphant moment of rope-a-dope. But both sides of rope-a-dope for me are the loser side. Anyway, now just to rhetorically supplement all of this, and now I see I've already violated what I was going to say. I noticed that in the intro I say, please listen to what I'm saying, not as a rant, but put it on pianissimo. So one question that emerges for me is not only what is a rant. Do you know what a rant is? It's like a tirade. It's like almost what I was just doing when your voice is raised and you're just talking at the other, like an alcoholic sometimes. You're just, you see, that's a rant. Does that help? Does that explain? Did I miss something? So I'm saying this isn't a rant, but why do I have to say that? But put it on pianissimo. So what would happen? What are the decibels of thinking? When Heidegger says thinking and thanking, he, first of all, wipes away all rhetorical traces of polemics, which comes from polemos, which is fight, the war zone. Polemics is something that Heidegger says is not thinking. It's violence, it's duking it out, it's not allowing the space and release and kind of endless adjustment necessary for thinking. Thinking has to be quiet and still. And then Heidegger raises the decibels by saying, but there was someone who had to scream because she was not heard. And some of us have read this together and in Was heißt denken, Lecture 5. And that was, he goes from the mother without transition to Nietzsche. And he said, Nietzsche had to scream to be heard. Nietzsche, no, he says this, Nietzsche, quietest and stillest of all thinkers. So my question would be, how do you know when a thinker is quiet and still? Nietzsche had to scream to be heard. So this is the famous location of the Schreiben, Schrei, the cri, écrit, so the cry, the scream, or what I translate, because in English it doesn't work, maybe, and the grito escrito, the inscribing cry. I have the cry inscribed somehow, but it's not, doesn't satisfy me. So the question is also when you're presenting work or doing work, what would happen? Could you imagine coming up to Wolfgang Schirmacher and presenting your work in this position and disposition of Was heißt denken? You know, so these are some of the thoughts that went into the title.
I don't know what voice I have to continue.
Well, you don't rant. You never rant. Actually, I would love to see you. Yeah, I've never seen you rant publicly or privately with me.
I wanted to just go back an instant to what you were coming upon of the countertransference field and the obsessive patient, because it's a real question for me as an analyst, but also as a thinker, is that it's the figure of obsession. I think the figure of obsession is the figure of creativity itself. I mean, it's the haunted figure of thinking as receptive to something that haunts the living from the dead, maybe, but also from a region of thinking that calls upon you to be responded. So that thinking would not be so much as a quest than a response. That's would be a Levinasian attitude, but I think you can find that in Socrates too. I would say that the obsession is the question, le patient obsessionnel, like the Ratman. I would come back to this very preliminary definition, very, very shortened, of course, that the hysteric person is someone who asks himself or herself, am I a woman or a man, in terms of desire? And the obsessional patient, neurosis, obsessional neurosis, asks himself and you, am I dead or alive? So it's, and the challenge of the obsessional patient, it's that, of course, it's the perfect patient. Because he's on this challenge of the superego and this commanding law inside him, he will be perfectly in time, perfectly there with the perfect questions and answers, and he will put you in a mastering place where he just doesn't want you to move from. He'll be the patient, you'll be the master, and the world is going to, set in a slow, tranquil motion until death. What slowly by slowly you understand is that he's already immobile in the graveyard. He's already dead, and the whole energy is to make you think he's alive, and sometimes to make as if some events of his life could, remember him, that he still has a little time to go. But the whole energy is to just let the grave untouched. So the whole disposal is a stage disposal, is a theater where the inside is a pure chaos. The obsessional patient is completely ordered. Of course, he's not only ordered from the outside but by this compelling law, but also from the inside, that he has to order to do the ordering of his so-called life, that is in reality a sort of death, instant by instant. Otherwise, you would he can't authorize you in any way, because it's far too dangerous to peek over and see the chaos that is, if he would hesitate one moment and stay in this hesitation, would reveal itself as completely dismantled, have an effect, an immediate effect of disrupting his life and his self and his ego. Why am I just, because you stopped in this figure, because I think it's a sort of metaphor of today's subject. I mean, we want to be put in that place somehow, and much of the depression today I see is on this field. Maybe the history of the 20th century was going from hysteria to névrose obsessionnelle, and that we seem to be far more tranquil in that place than hysteria. But what's the price of this? And the question of the fight, Vico recalls, the Italian philosopher, remembers us that polemos and polis has the same Greek root, and that so in the polis, as a definition, there is the polemos, the combat, the fight.
Do you mean the polis or the police?
The polis, the city. Sorry.
Okay.
No, sorry. The city. Such as one could say that in the individual, the principle, the death drive, or the principle of hate might haunt the subject before any possibility of attachment. Lacan forged a word that called enamoration. Enamoration in French is to become in love, sort of the process of being in love. But it begins with enamoration, and en is hate. So he spelled it in the way as hate becoming love is a word saying that to the principle of something that is an attachment, like you could say a police city is a growing of attached community somehow in a relationship. There's something that haunts it, that worries it from the beginning, that would be on the side of polemos, of hate, of unrecognition, and what can we do with this vacillation, this interrogation. And it's interesting that, going back to the neurotic patient, that those patients ask us to be the living theater of the possibility of doubt, hesitation, of hysteria, really. So I think you can't go through an analysis. Either you just obey his rule, because in fact it's his rule, that you're the master, he's the enslaved one, and it can go forever. You'll be very happy, you'll be a very happy psychoanalyst, and he'll be a very happy patient, and nothing will ever change in his life. And if you take it on yourself to express his chaos, if you are breaking free enough in yourself, and that's the counter where intervenes the countertransfer. And that's, I think, the genius of Freud, that precisely in this amazing, rapid, completely successful cure of the Ratman, he wrote it as a failure, and to say it quickly, and because I think he understood that you have to expose the failures, the angst, the chaos in the other as an analyst, and to let it open for the other, so that he can relate through you to his own chaos, because he can't relate to it directly, otherwise it would be too dangerous, and too dangerous as getting to life. He thinks it's a death danger. It's the other way around. And it's all about what is to be alive, in fact. And maybe it's what grounds any encounter. I agree completely what you say in an encounter as an event, as a traumatic event that initiates a new time. And I like the Winnicott way of saying also that when a session begins, you don't have the unconscious of the patient and unconscious of the psychoanalyst anymore. You have an inter-unconscious that's created for the moment, and that is no longer one or the other, but this common space where even dreams, phantasma, and unsaid, unspoken desires can linger and act together. And I think maybe on the bottom of any encounter there is this question of for the other, we are the space of the chaos, the unsaid, unspelled place of the chaos of the other, that he doesn't know about and that you don't even know about either, but that can be expelled by the meeting, if the meeting is a real one. So
and the meeting also can speak the disavowed parts of self and other. In other words, the parts that are normally disavowed and nicely put aside suddenly are talking to each other in a very dangerous, risky way. In a true encounter, there's some danger there, because there's that what Hölderlin calls the dangerous proximity. Question of what's the proper distance and so on. These are questions of thinking and talking and reading. What is over-reading? What is a too close reading? And so on and so forth. These are some questions I just wanted to add in terms of the distinction that you make very beautifully and elegantly of between the hysteric and the obsessional neurotic. Freud gives us, of course, one of the greatest obsessional neurotics is Hamlet. And by the way, with obsessional neuroses comes proclivity and pleasure to pun. you have a very slippery, sliding relation to the signifier. The obsessional neurotic jams on language in a certain way, has a certain relation to language, that likes to pun and create neologisms. The obsessional neurotic, according to Freud, doesn't wear a watch. Any put a ring on it. No, doesn't wear a watch, right? Because you know why? Because the obsessional neurotic wants to be in perpetual doubt, like what the hell time is it, you know? And that this is almost the kind of not only the doom and condemnation of the obsessional neurotic, but also the jouissance or bliss of being freaked out about the time. Are you going to make it to your appointment? Are you not? Your whole career depends on it. God forbid you should have, well, nowadays with the cell phone, all of this might have to reconfigure, but nonetheless, God forbid you should have worn a watch or before cell phone times. So another distinction between hysteria and obsessional neuroses that Freud makes is the hysteric when faced with love or the other or the encounter. The hysteric says, and you may recognize someone when I say this, in your lives. The hysteric says, is that all there is? That's it? This is what we've been hoping for, dreaming for, organizing our dreams around and our unconscious lives around? That's it? Whereas the obsessional neurotic says, holy shit, this is too much for me. I'm overwhelmed. I cannot do this. I can't take it. Bye. So I don't know if you know what I'm talking about here. But those are the distinctions in terms of encountering the event of the encounter of the hysterical and the obsessional neurotic. We have to remember that for Freud, obsessional neuroses is, he says, a dialect of hysteria, so they're not absolutely separable. I see some of you with dreamy smiles and remembering yourselves or your others, your partners, your almost partners, your have-been partners, you could have been partners in this little paradigm of that's it. That's all you have to offer me. This is what we've been, hoping for.
You forgot the phobic figure.
Okay, the phobic. All right, tell us. Tell us about the phobic. That is also a big fight. Is phobia, as you know, and in all of the social phobias as well. And I was going to say homeopathic. No, but homophobia. But the phobic who I suppose shuts down. I'm sure you have a more...
Phobia materializes the object of his desire, unknown desire, in the form of something that he will be afraid of, or he will always flee from it, but organize his life such as he will be in a territory where he will have to come upon the thing, of course. And
he'll absolutely always, or she'll organize life unconsciously and put the GPS on to make sure you run into the very thing that phobes you out.
Of course.
Yeah.
And also it's really like a figuration of the traumatic event that will call upon you on the most unexpected, supposedly unexpected place. In fact, it's organized, as you said, but supposedly, and it will come up onto you like a spectrum in Hamlet, in fact to sort of will you take me, the object, the phobic object is, will you take me in at last? Will you please, when you make something of me, or should I be definitely expelled on the land of the death or the traumatic past, and the phobic person keeps saying, I can't, I won't let you in, because if I let you in, I disappear. We can't be both. That's another encounter. We can't be both in the same place. And I remember a phobic patient telling me that a very common phobia of ascenseur, lift.
Of the elevator.
Yes, that she realized one day that a woman put her newborn baby in her arms, and that with the newborn baby she could, do 13 stages without problems. So that she realized that the protection it was the baby protecting her and not her holding the baby. And what was this presence as a counterphobic? Because, of course, the phobic only works with counterphobic ritualized objects that would constantly put at peace reality, tame it, as if reality was in danger of swallowing her or he all the time. It's a sort of magic ritualization of life that can be quite creative. I mean, lots of artists have a phobic side, and it's quite a creative ground, unless it really gets to a point that it asphyxiates your life with all sorts of forbidden plans. It's interesting to see that when you work with success with a phobic person, usually the phobic object displaces. And you have to say to the patient almost in advance, look here, you think you're cured, but it's going to come back by another way. It's not going to be lifts anymore, but your stepmother or someone
that you program. We're going to momentarily take a break, but I want to know now from you. As you can see, we have a certain range of a certain critical range of motion here. So we are at your disposition. We can have a discussion that continues in this way, or would you like to take advantage of our being here in this place of readiness and openness to you and your work, and we're prepared to be called upon to engage what you feel you need to know from this encounter, or to gather from this, or retrieve, or even rectify in terms of other unfinished projects or work. So how would you like to proceed? Does anyone have a strong avidity for one form? Melanie Klein always considered sessions, perhaps such as this, but certainly psychoanalytical, as the dilemma of giving a good feed. So how does one give a good feed to the other? How does one respond to the implicit demand here? Paris? Yes?
Well, I don't know about the format of the rest of the class, but I did want to see if we could possibly go back to one remark Professor Ronell made about this giving up of your convictions and ideas as your own, many of which are apophenic to begin with in the sort of Heideggerian sense, and think of them as if they come to you. And I'm wondering about the relationship or possible relationship between this and Heidegger's Es gibt.
Okay.
As opposed to a formulation like Levinas, who says, the there is what fills the void of the nothingness. Es gibt is something different. And finally, whether the Ratman in his neurotic compulsiveness, it has a kind of Gelassenheit to him.
Gelassenheit, lassitude, or Heideggerian, the last word on, yeah.
That he's open to the world. This maybe can be in the policy.
That's so fabulously perverse. I never even thought of that. Because, the obsessional neurotic is, by the way, I bring it up because for Freud has the nerve to say in there, philosophers should read what I have to say about obsessional neurosis, because that is the symptomatology underlying thinking. And that's why I want, and it's a relation to language, to the law, to prohibition everywhere. So you are asking about the possibility of a relatedness between Gelassenheit, which I'll explain, or you'll explain later, and if Heidegger could only hear you now, bringing him closer to neurotic despair. This is very, very outrageous, and I love it, so thank you. Julia?
I wonder if you might consider talking about the relationship between sort of, which you've been hinting towards, the pedagogical relationship. And this series of interviews, which are also relating to a psychoanalytic session, you mentioned the irony of the titling, but I wonder if there's some sort of ironic happening in the interviews themselves, which is serving to disarticulate the psychoanalytic session and to maybe as a repetitioning.
That's very important too. All of this is, and I was thinking that this is very linked to what Thomas asks, because the pedagogical register that we will want to mark in the terms that you both raise, is it training, coaching, what a kind of, Nietzsche, for example, says, I'm just an animal trainer. That's my teaching method, so to speak. But that is honoring, because he doesn't want to get into your spaces of interiority or terror or this or that in a certain way. He doesn't want to mind fuck. He just wants a relation of training into the beautiful and noble animal. Okay, we can nowadays dispute all of those terms, but nonetheless, just note that the questions that are being raised also involve the different modalities of the teaching body or the student body, the virginal student body, that from, I don't know if you know what socratiser means in French. It comes obviously from Socrates, and it's to twist your finger up someone's ass. That is the Socratic method, by the way. And I will get back to it, because now we're talking my language. We will go into the places of the body where learning, the orificial openings to learning, the traumatic openings, ever since Ratman, it has to circuit through the ass, through the anus. Otherwise, you're just, which is what a seminar is all about, the insemination. Now you finally got me excited. Okay, no, I was excited the whole time. Yes, please.
Because psychoanalysis comes from this Western tradition with its assumptions and histories and all of that, I'm wondering how, within the field itself, how psychoanalysis deals with the question of other cultures and other viewpoints, because it does come from this tradition. It comes with certain assumptions, and how that translates.
That's you. But I just want to say that very, very good, very welcome, because psychoanalysis also scandalously opened the lens on the other and what had been circumscribed as the alien other that couldn't be even encountered. So we do, but very good question, but also to note that the dark continent, so to speak, and other scandalous tropes for non-white cultures was also what Freud located in mind, let's say it quickly, but we'll really want to address that. Yes.
Just in case we run out of things.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this question of sort of where the war zone ends, and especially how that's mediated through technology, the internet, and those sorts of things.
Okay, anyone else? Because it's true, there's a paucity here.
As a corollary to what you were just saying, the idea of theory being the thing that we follow that we love, and that it leads to this zone of a sort of subjective nationalistic zone.
So listen, I don't know if there's more questions in all this, but we have to sign a contract now. If I do not, or Anne does not fully inhabit and articulate and respond to your question, it doesn't mean we don't love you. Can you understand that? And let me explain. There's a question of when a question arrives. So in my temporal, God-helmety kind of quasi-existence, it might take me a few weeks to suddenly wake up at 3 in the morning and want to engage your question. I may call you at that time, but I may just call out to you. So do not feel that it will not have arrived. Do not feel that the velocities are guaranteed or that there's a hierarchy of filtrage and sorting and sifting here. And don't think that those of you who didn't explicitly raise your voices, I got your questions as well, and Anne will be receptive to those as well. So we're hearing you, but this is fabulous and exciting and a real assignment, task, and mission at once. So I'm excited about this, but let's take a break from each other and return with the freshness of being.